Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Locke's second treatise. Today we're looking at chapter 12, which deals on the legislative, executive, and federal power of a Commonwealth. Last time we met, last session we did chapter 11, which dealt with legislative power. Now he's kind of summarizing it again. This is going to be 6 sections, so we'll look at it. It's going to be shorter than a little bit than the other one in that sense. But let's start. Okay. The legislative power, at section 143, the legislative power that is, which is the right to direct how the force of the Commonwealth shall be employed for preserving the community and the members of it. Okay, so therefore, he seems to collapse. And remember, in the previous chapter, he kind of says, well, there's a limit to even preserving members of it in that sense, that the individual members may have to be sacrificed, they'll preserve the rights of the individual members to the degree that it is supportive to the collective, the collective good of the whole. In other words, if individuals saving an individual from something, preserving the individual, may cause destructive to the everyone's survival, then maybe you will sacrifice that in that sense. I mean, that's why it's not absolute. Here, it's a little less clear. Here, he seems to suggest that it's both. It is employed for the preserving of the community and its members of it, right? So it's he's not. This is it's true, but then he qualifies it a little bit earlier in the last chapter. But because of those laws which are constantly to be executed, and whose force is always to continue, may be made in a little time. Therefore, there is no need that the legislative should be always in being, not having always business to do so. So therefore, it doesn't have to be. The legislature does not always have to exist. It should exist. Therefore, the idea is that um, um, it should be exercising for that. And in other words, it needs to be executed, right? And whose force always needs to exist. But it may be a little time. It may be made in a little time. In other words, making it. The difference between making it and carrying it out. The actor who has to carry it out always has to be, but the making of it doesn't always have to be. The time may be short. Therefore, the coming together of the legislative body may come and go, passing cycles, right? Therefore, does not always have to be. Not always. In other words, it may a little time, and therefore there is no need. The legislature should always be in being, not having always business to do. And because it may be too great a temptation to human frailty, apt to grasp at power, for the same persons who have the power of making laws, to have also in their hands the power of executing them, whereby they may exempt themselves from obedience to the laws they make, and suit the law, both in its making and execution, to their own private advantage, and thereby come to have a distinct interest from the rest of the community, contrary to the end of society and government. Therefore, in a well-ordered commonwealth, where the good of the whole is to be considered, as it ought, the legislative power is put in the hands of diverse persons, who, duly assembled, have by themselves or jointly with others a power to make laws, which when they have done, being separated again, they are themselves subject to the laws they have made, which is a new and near tie upon them, to take care that they make them for the public good. So therefore, the idea is, he seems that there is a division of power in Locke in that sense. He's arguing that it's not a safe thing to have the executive power and legislative power hold by the same entity. He's arguing that the legislative power and the executive power needs to kind of be separated to some degree. Why? Because if they're if the person making the laws is also enforcing them, and it's tied to a person who is, a body or a group that's separate from the whole, they will start, as he says, they'll see their own interest as separate from the rest of everyone else. So therefore, the legislative body should always be taught not permanent body, a non-permanent body, or if it is a permanent body, the members of it should not be permanent. Um, and, and therefore, the idea here is that they should cycle in and out, and therefore the people should be the people should be able to appoint that representatives, right? Although and this idea that they don't have to always meet, the legislature doesn't always have to meet because they can go do their own, and also that if they and whoever the legislature is, they need to be bound. The makers of the law need to be bound by the law because so when they leave, they will understand that they are affected by the law, and therefore they will, being bound by the law, they would want to make that the law is beneficial to them when they're outside in their own private interests. So therefore, there's, in other words, by making sure that the law is applicable to everyone, ensures that there does not become a separate interest between the rulers and the ruled. Okay, because remember, in fact, the rulers are the ruled by in their election or selection of the members of the legislature. 144. Because the laws, which are at once and in a short time made, have a consistent and lasting force, and needs a perpetual execution, or in attendance thereunto. Therefore, it is necessary there should be a power always in being, which should see to the execution of the laws that are made and remain in force. And thus, the legislative and executive powers come to be separated. So the idea is that legislature doesn't have to always be. Legislative power can dissolve. I mean, not the body, the concept of legislature can dissolve, but the body that exercises it can dissolve. And perhaps should dissolve in his argument, so that, or at least the agents who are selected in it should dissolve, so that they can be again recalled, selected, and reappointed or elected by those who they represent, right? So and they should not be permanent in that sense. They should always be a cycling of things. So to avoid the danger of any class being so empowered and not recallable by the people, and not and also because they will create laws that that don't subject them, right? That's the danger of this, and that's why they should be at one sense like that. But also there needs to be a separate of enforcement of the law versus the making of the law. And that's because the enforcement of the law needs always be. There needs to be a continual existence of those agents enforcing the law. Okay, and therefore there's this distinction here about this, right? And why they need to be separated. This leads to section 145. There is another part. There is another part in every Commonwealth, which one may call neutral, because it is that which answers to the power of every man naturally before they enter into society. For though in a commonwealth the members of it are distinct persons, still in reference to one another, and as such as governed by the laws of society, yet in reference to the rest of mankind they're one body, which is as every member of it was before, still in the state of nature with the rest of mankind. So therefore, there's another thing, and it's called neutral in this sense, because it's not relationship between them. It's not a force of rule which affects them per se in their. It's aimed at them regarding each other, but rather it is dealing with like them in the state of nature where everyone's against everyone else. This force is dealing with them as the body. Okay, this power or this this power is aimed at, or what he says, them as a body in that sense, protecting them as the body in relation with others outside, right? So, in other words, okay, there's society, and it referenced the rest of mankind, that they make one body, which is in every way as before, still in the state of nature with the rest of mankind. Pierre, right? That's repeat. Hence, it is that hence it is that the controversies which happen between any man of society with those who are out of it are managed by the public, and an injury done to a member of their body engages the whole in the reparation of it. So therefore, wait a minute. So therefore, an individual person with someone from outside, this is a problem. In other words, in a state of nature, it's between them and them. But as a member of the society, and the fact that this individual is now protected, is now within the framework of this individual outside of the community acting on them now becomes under the, in other words, he does not have the action, the right to do this. Rather, this new power acts on behalf of that individual in to address that harm or that dispute. Um, and this is what he says here, right? As was, in other words, this is a reparation. In other words, uh, um, hence it is that controversies between any man of society and those that are out of it are managed by the public, and the injuries done to a member of their body engages the whole in the reparation of it. So that under this consideration, the whole community is one body in the state of nature in respect to all other states or persons out of its community. So therefore, any relationship to the outside, in other words, the outside state cannot go to you, oh, I'm punishing you, you over here, this individual. No, it's going to be in a relationship. I'm sorry, he's our person under our protection, and we will act. If you're going to act on him, we will act against you, a state or private person, uh, 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 because they're in our society under our law, under our authority, right? 146. This therefore contains the power of war and peace, leagues and alliances, and all the transactions with all persons and communities without the Commonwealth, which may be called federative if one pleases. So the thing be understood, I am indifferent to its name. In other words, he calls us federal. This is his invention, federal. We would understand this as foreign policy. This is the realm of state executive authority. This is federative power in our friend Locke here is not what Americans understand as this relationship between state and national government, federalism. Okay, this idea of this division of authority between the federal, that the union government and the states. Okay, because the American system was a union of states, confederacy or federation, which and therefore federative does not mean as part of a federation. Federative in Locke means it's the executive authority of it is kind of an executive authority that deals with the rights and goods of the collective and the individuals in relationship to people outside the outside world, that of individuals in the state of nature or states in the state of nature. The states were meant, in other words, commonwealths or states are in the state of nature and are acting in the state of nature, and therefore, because there's no ultranational authority that has authority over them in the sense for Locke. And in fact, we can say that this is in IR theory, you call this the anarchical society, right? Even though we attempt the end of the 19th century and 20th century, we've created these international bodies that have quasi authority, but they only have quasi authority because state actors have authorized them to. They have no autonomy on their own to act against the thing, and are really just really acting out the agency of this, like how confederacies tend to work. In other words, confederacies, the power rests in the members, not in the central authority, so that therefore these international entities don't have any real authority to do anything other than what the members have authorized it to do. And very little sometimes, maybe even the ability to act may be controlled or stymied by the more powerful members, right? So therefore, this is where we end up at 46. Therefore, this is, and therefore he's not even a system. We call it federative. This is why it's so. He calls it this, but he says, "This is, I'm indifferent to if you want to use some other term." And 147, these two powers, the executive and the federative, though they may be really distinct in themselves, yet comprehending the execution of the municipal laws of society within itself, upon all that are part of it, the other the management of security and interest of the public without, with all those that it may receive benefit or damage from. In other words, these are two different things. The first here, in other words, the executive deals with the execution. The executive deals with the execution of laws which are upon itself and upon all that are part of. Right. That's executive, and the federative is the management of security of the public without and all that may benefit and damage from it. Right. Yet they are always almost united. This is what he's saying. The executive tends to unite both. Even though they're separate and they have different things, they tend to be united in this sense, right? And although this federal power is the well or ill management, no, no, no. And although this federal power in the well or ill management of it be of great momentum to the Commonwealth, yet it is much less capable to be discredited by antecedent. In other words, there's something about this that even though it does impact the Commonwealth, or the ill use of it can have great impact. In other words, he seems to be it is less capable to be directed by antecedent, standing, positive laws than the executive. In other words, it is direct. In other words, you can't direct. In other words, the executive can be maintained by these positive laws. The positive laws bind and dictate the executive act. But federative power, because it's dealing at the realm of nature, cannot be easily, managed, or in other words, managed or controlled by the in other words, he said this: that although the federal power in it, well or ill management may be great Commonwealth, yet it's less capable of being directed by antecedent standing positive laws than the executive, and so must necessarily be left to the prudence and wisdom of those whose hands it is in, to be managed for the public good. For the laws that concern subjects ought subjects one amongst another, being being to direction their actions, may well enough precede them. Period. In other words, he's saying here. What he's saying here is, okay. Executive, in other words, executive authority is bound by law. Therefore, in one sense, this idea that the executive is contained by law. In other words, the executive can only do what the law permits. But in its relationship on the federative power, no, you can't bind it that way because it's in the state of nature, and therefore, in the state of nature, there's all these possibilities that exist that are outside the scope of that normal society, because of the nature of regulation of society has kind of more regulated, and that they're not subject to the same laws and that stuff. And therefore, this is necessarily left to prudence and wisdom of those. In other words, you have more discretion, right? This is, I think, where someone like Carl Schmitt, in his concept of the exception, will get his idea of the exception. In other words, the sovereign actor in relation to this crisis or emergency. This is federative power in many sense. This is federative power. This idea of the idea that the state actor is in relationship in the state of nature or with other states has to have some discretion and independence and cannot be bound by law in the way that the modern liberal likes to have it. The modern liberal wants to apply what the law and these procedural rules and remove from discretion prudence, right? Left to this, he's saying prudence and the wisdom of those whose hands it is in. That's discretion. There is a realm of discretion here in federative power that often is not necessarily in executive power in Locke in that sense. So let's continue the next sentence here, the last sentence of this paragraph. But what is done in reference to foreigners depends much upon their actions, and the variations of designs and interest must be left in great part to the prudence of those who have this power committed to them, and be managed by the best of their skills for the advantage of the Commonwealth. So what's he saying here is that this is like, again, this I think where someone like Schmitt in his exception will look at this and say, oh, this is This is why the neo-Kantian position sought to following from Kant that everything should be. In other words, there is a misunderstanding of. I mean, Kant gets to the point where he wants everything to be under control of law, legislation. Everything to be under legislation. In other words, the as once you have legislation, once legislation has been made, the executive is merely administration of what has been done, what has been decided by the legislature. This is how the kind of executive. This is how the modern liberal view of executive power under like Locke is. The Locke, there's no prudence, there's no room for prudence in this. Maybe prudence in the exercise, but very limited sense and this is more technical prudence in a very technical application. The question of application, right? There's only prudence in the realm of application, not in formulation. Formulation is done by law, okay, not by not by by the legislature, and not done by the executive. The executive has no power of legislation. He only has the mechanism of application of the law, and and prudence may play in that, but it plays a much smaller role than federative power, where it's the decision making about this, about what is to be done to solve this, is cannot be done or legislated in that way. Um, and 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 I think this is a very important point in this sense. Locke realizes that the legislative power cannot be exercised in this way, and I think this is the crux of the danger. In other words, but wait a minute, but isn't the federal power in the hand of who? Is it in the hand of a body? If it's executive body that always exists, right? Maybe we should separate the executive and federative in that sense. Um, but that tends not to happen. It tends always to be the executive and the federative tends to be in agreement. But then doesn't the tendency of the ability of exercising and making decisions on the federative lead them to want to do the same thing on the domestic, on the executive authority? This is the creepy crawly danger of, wait a minute, in the federative area, I have big discretion to make decisions that supersede the authority of the legislature. My prudence and judgment, it's again, it is must be dictated for the preservation of the Commonwealth, right? It is granted that your exercise of prudence and your exercise of this power that is done for the security and well-being of the Commonwealth, the public good, as is the legislative power in that sense. So therefore, we left at this moment here. Let's look at 148. Though, as I've said, the executive and federative power of every commonwealth is really distinct in themselves, yet they're hardly to be separated and placed at the same time in the hands of distinct persons. For both of them requiring the force of society for their existence. In other words, he says that even though they're separate in reality, but they're hardly separated in practice, and are placed at the same time in the hands of distinct persons. Both of them requiring the force of society for their exercise. In other words, they need the force of society for their exercise. It is almost impractical to place the force of the Commonwealth in distinct and not subordinate hands, or that the executive and federative power should be placed in persons that might act separately, whereby the force of the public would be under different commands, which would be apt sometimes or others to cause disorder and ruin. In other words, this is a question, and I think this is for Locke. It's there's no one simple answer. He says, well, sometimes it makes sense that they're put together because by separating them, this might, lead to conflict between the two and might cause. And if actually this is something Schmidt talks about the dangers of the Roman councils, right? This is why the Romans had to create dictatorship in that sense, because the dictator was the in time of crisis they had to turn to a dictator because the Romans were so feared of executive authority. But again, they didn't distinguish between federative and executive. The councils were separated, right? They divided the councils up because they were so afraid of the king. So therefore, this in Locke's issue is not addressed by them. It's merely executive authority, and actually they didn't even distinguish between executive and legislative authority. The Romans solved the problem of legislative authority by giving it to the Senate, and the executive authority by the councils, right? But they even feared the councils because they feared the power that it had, and usually they combined the councils with executive and executive and federative power in a sense. But because they feared that problem, they feared that the king, in other words, that was the king's thing, that the king had all three aspects in one. The Rex, the Roman king, was both legislator, executive, and also federative, right? And therefore, like this, and therefore they needed to be a kind of decisive leader. This is why there's that plague. The Romans feared the decisive leader, and at yet time gave rise. And the legal structure of the republic uh, created the concept of the dictator, which gave all power, even also legislative power. Remember, you have to remember that the dictator even exercises legislative power, and the only thing that limits him is the length, that his time is linked by the time of the crisis or the set, like 6 months or a certain time. And therefore, once that time is been reached, the Senate has to reauthorize it again, or legislative power returns to this. So that um, uh, 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 this is that weird thing in that dictatorship. Dictatorship is a kind of return to the king in that sense. But the Romans therefore decided that this federative power, and therefore Locke here wants to say this unique, sometimes dividing it would be problematic. It might lead to competition of power. And other times it may be necessary to do this because of something, So this is again a realm of prudence of the question, or that there might be difference of opinions here. Okay, we're ending this chapter here. We will turn next to 13, which deals with the subordination of the powers of the Commonwealth. If you have any questions or comments about what we covered today, please put it below. I will answer them when I see them. If you like what we've done, like and share. If you don't like and say why in the comments. What I can do better, and I said maybe talk more clearly, or not be so animated, right? Not repeat myself, but use a better text, whatever. Subscribe, please, if you want to see more of this. Share with a friend. Share the video and encourage a friend to subscribe. Please, there's only way this happens because YouTube's not going to subscribe me because who knows what we do. If you want to follow me on social media, you can follow me on below. If you wish to help me continue doing these things, you can do so by becoming a member of Patreon or through Subscribestar. That's the links below. Or you can just want to help me. You can always buy a book. My other books you can always buy. I don't get the profit. I don't get any money from my Washington University book. I still get a little bit of money once in a while from my USU books. But this book I do get. I did this summer, and this is my little workbook on Aristotle's notebook on Aristotle's politics. It's a workbook. It's a study guide. It's kind of like a Cliff's book, Cliff's notes on. I can't use that term. That would be a copyright violation, right? On Aristotle's politics, or that you're reading Aristotle. But we're not reading Aristotle. But what, you have one on Locke. So no, again, I taught Locke more. I've taught Locke as a teacher, and therefore I'm doing this more kind of like as being a teacher to you guys. So that's it for the day. I will see you again in our next session. I hope everyone.